Okay, so picture this. You're in a courtroom. The jury delivers a guilty verdict,
Uh-oh.
and you're sentenced to 25 years to life
Wow.
for murder. But get this, 13 people can put you hundreds of miles away at the time.
No way. That's wild.
It's the story of Richard Rosario, and
Oh,
today we're diving deep into his case.
really digging into it.
We'll be using court records, and we'll hear from people involved thanks to journalist Dan Slepian.
That's amazing access. So 13 people saying he wasn't there.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Definitely a tangled web. We'll try to unravel it.
Okay, so let's set the scene. 1996, the Bronx, George Collazo shot and killed in a parking lot.
Execution style.
Right, his friend Michael Sanchez is there, but somehow escapes unharmed.
Unharmed. Wow.
He goes cold for a bit, but then Richard Rosario is arrested and convicted.
So Collazo's family, they must have felt some relief.
Of course, desperate for answers and justice, that arrest brought some closure.
Makes sense, feeling like the right person's held accountable.
And that feeling gets stronger when two of Collazo's sisters, Wanukika and Thina, visit Rosario in jail.
What they wanted to confront him.
Yeah, they wanted to look him in the eye and hear his denial firsthand.
Wow, that's a powerful encounter.
It really was, and this meeting becomes a turning point.
How so?
They went in hoping for remorse or even a confession, but instead,
Noticed that.
they saw anger and defiance in Rosario.
And that just cemented their belief that he was guilty.
Exactly, but here's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
Rosario, from the start, says he wasn't even in New York when the murder happened.
Wait, so where was he?
He claims he was in Florida, and he has alibi witnesses to back him up.
Okay. But a couple people, maybe?
Not just a couple. Try 13.
13? Are you serious?
Yeah, family, friends, even a police officer who'd interacted with him there.
Okay, now this is where things get really fascinating. 13 people all saying he was in Florida.
It makes you wonder, how could 13 people all corroborate a false alibi?
Right. What would their motive even be?
And when you listen to Dan Slepian's interviews with them, they're not hesitant or vague. They're detailed and specific, absolutely convinced that he was with them in Florida.
Do any of them have a particularly strong memory?
One even remembers watching a specific basketball game with Rosario on the night of the murder.
Whoa, those are the kind of details you don't just make up.
Exactly. Their shared experiences, the kind that stick with you.
So you can't just dismiss them easily.
So we've got this convicted man swearing he's innocent, 13 people backing him up, and on the other side,
Yeah.
the prosecution saying it's faulty memory, or even suggesting some witnesses were coerced.
Wow, classic clash of narratives, right? Who do you believe?
Right? Whose version of the truth holds more weight, and what if the system got it wrong?
That's a scary thought.
And when you hear Rosario speaking from prison, you hear his frustration and anger.
Understandable.
He admits he may have come across poorly during that jail visit with Collazo's sisters.
Yeah, but you can imagine the stress of that situation.
Exactly. But remember, we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah.
This case gets even more complex. As we hear Wanukika's story, she starts to think her brother's murder wasn't random.
Okay, this is getting good.
Yeah, and that changes everything.
Yeah.
So we have this conviction, the family thinks justice is done, but these 13 alibis, they just don't go away.
A shadow of doubt for sure. And now we get to Wanukika's story. She believed Rosario was guilty,
Right.
but she also starts to think maybe her brother's murder wasn't random.
It adds a whole new layer, right?
Absolutely. This isn't just about Rosario's alibi anymore.
Right.
Now we need to figure out why George was killed. Could someone else be responsible?
And this is where it gets really interesting. Wanukika says, about 2 weeks before George died, he told her about a fight he'd had with a woman named Lamari Leon.
This is getting complicated.
It is. Things got out of hand and George slapped her.
Slapped her, wow.
Yeah, and the thing is, Lamari was dating Michael Sanchez.
No way, George's friend who was with him that night.
Exactly. So now we got to ask, did Lamari threaten George? After that, did she want him dead, and what about Sanchez?
Right, where does he fit in?
Wanuki says George was actually afraid of Lamari. He even started carrying a gun.
He felt threatened.
He did. He told Wanukika that Lamari had connections. She could make him disappear.
So now there's this element of fear, like George knew he was in danger.
It changes everything,
Yep.
right? It's not just a random encounter anymore.
Definitely, it could have been planned to hit. And this is where former detective Bobby Delarado comes in.
He was one of the first officers on the scene that night, and he's always believed that George's death was a hit.
So he thinks it was planned.
He does, and he points to a few details that support that theory.
Like what kind of details?
Well, for example, the getaway car. It was parked right there, engine running like it was waiting for George.
That's suspicious.
Right. And then there's a hot dog vendor, who saw two men with guns near the parking lot earlier that day.
Two men with guns, so it wasn't just a random robbery.
That's what Delorado thinks. He even warned someone to be careful.
So you've got the guys with guns. It's starting to look like a planned hit.
Exactly. And then there's how George was killed, a single shot to the head execution style.
And Sanchez was right there, but unharmed.
That's the thing. If it was a robbery, why not shoot them both?
It doesn't add up why target George specifically.
And that brings us back to Michael Sanchez. Could he have been involved somehow?
Well, he was dating Lamari, the woman who threatened George, and he was the one who identified Rosario.
It's definitely suspicious, but we have to be careful here. We're not saying Sanchez did anything wrong.
Of course, he might have just been a witness to a terrible crime.
Right, but his connection to Lamari and all these suspicious details, they raise questions.
Did Sleepian ever talk to Sanchez?
He tried, but Sanchez never responded. He's never spoken publicly about the case.
So he's stale silent. It just adds to the mystery.
And just when you think things can't get any more complicated, another person enters the picture. Nicole Torres. She went to school with George and Michael, and she was there the night of the murder.
Another witness. This is getting wild.
Her story is important because it contradicts the police report. At first, she told the police she didn't see anything.
What?
Years later, she signed an affidavit saying she saw the whole thing.
An affidavit, that's a big deal.
It is in the affidavit. She says she heard the shooter say, "Hey, George, this is for you," right before shooting him.
Wow, that changes things completely. It means it wasn't random.
Exactly. And she saw the shooter escape in a car, just like Delorado said.
So the hit theory is looking more and more likely.
But the most important detail is this. Nicole says that Michael Sanchez told her right after the shooting that he didn't see the shooter's face.
Wait a minute, so he identified Rosario, but told Nicole he didn't see the shooter.
Yeah, it makes you question everything he said.
This completely undermines his credibility.
And there's an unredacted police report from Nicole's first interview that backs up her story about Sanchez.
So there's proof.
He was buried in the case files for years and only came out because of Rosario's new lawyers.
Enter the Exoneration Initiative. Those guys are amazing.
They are attorneys. Glenn Garber and Rebecca Friedman took on Rosario's case pro bono. They believe he's innocent.
It's like David and Goliath. They're taking on the whole system.
They are, and they're using this new evidence to try to reopen the case.
It's not going to be easy, though.
No. The Bronx DA's office, they're pushing back. They're saying the alibis are unreliable and that Nicole is incredible.
They're sticking to their guns.
They are. They say they're reinvestigating, but they haven't talked to any of Rosario's alibi witnesses.
That's a little worrying. Makes you wonder if they're really trying to find the truth.
So right now it's a waiting game. A judge has to decide if there should be a hearing for this new evidence.
Rosario and his family, they must be on the edge of their seats.
They've been waiting for justice for so long. It's just mind-boggling. So many conflicting stories. Police work that's questionable and a man who's spent decades locked up for something he says he didn't do. What do we do with all this?
I think Rosario's case really makes us look at our justice system. And not in a good way. It shows how eyewitness testimony can be wrong, how much power prosecutors have, and how human mistakes can ruin lives.
We've talked about reasonable doubt, but this case takes it to a whole new level. How can you convict someone with so much evidence pointing the other way?
It shows that finding justice isn't always simple. You know, there are twists and turns, roadblocks, and sometimes those roadblocks are people's biases, problems in the system, and not wanting to admit mistakes.
And those 13 alibi witnesses, if they're telling the truth, the system failed Richard Rosario big time. But even if their memories are off, like the prosecution said, it still makes you wonder, did they really investigate this thoroughly?
Yeah, were those alibis checked out? Were those people given a chance, or were they ignored because they didn't fit the story the prosecution wanted to tell? We need those answers.
And then there's Nicole Torres, her changing her story. And that police report, it throws the whole case out the window, makes you wonder what else is hidden in those files just waiting to be found.
That's where journalists like Dan Sleepian come in. He dug deeper, challenged the official story. If it wasn't for him, Rosario's case might have stayed buried.
It reminds us that we can't just believe everything we're told, especially when it comes to justice. We have to ask questions, dig for the truth, and hold those in power accountable.
And we can't forget about groups like the Exoneration Initiative. They're the real heroes fighting for people who have been wrongly convicted, giving them a voice and making sure justice is served, even if it takes a long time.
So what can we as listeners take away from all of this?
Yeah.
What does Rosario's case really mean?
Well, first, it shows us that even though our justice system is supposed to be fair and find the truth, it's run by people and people make mistakes. We have to be careful. demand transparency, and push for changes that prevent wrongful convictions from happening.
We also have to think critically about what we see and hear. Don't just accept things. Dig deeper. Look at different sides and be ready to question the way things are.
And most importantly, this case shows that hope never dies. Even after all these years, Rosario and his family never gave up on the truth. They believed that justice would be served. It's inspiring. It shows the strength of the human spirit and reminds us to never stop fighting for what's right.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Richard Rosario's case. It's a story that makes us think, challenges our beliefs, and leaves us with a feeling that we all need to work for a world that's fair and more just.